On July 6, 1897, the New Orleans City Council officially legalized prostitution in a 38-block area just north of the French Quarter. The intent behind it was to better regulate the many illicit activities taking place within the city at the time, while still maintaining their nominal illegality everywhere else. Alderman Sidney Story, the man whose name, to his great chagrin, would soon become synonymous with the newly sanctioned Vice District, was purported to have gotten the idea from similar setups in the port cities of Germany and Amsterdam. He and his fellow political reformers hoped that a seemingly less visible concentration would help improve the city's reputation. Between the streets of North Robertson, Iberville, Basin, and St. Louis, people were allowed to practice and solicit prostitution without fear of legal reprisals and within full view of the policemen monitoring the various brothels and gambling houses. This was not the first vice district in New Orleans, or even the largest, but it would be the last and the most notorious. The model had first been used in 1857 to create the Swamp, an extremely notorious area located between South Robertson and South Liberty. During this time, a man could wander into the swamp and for a picayune, about 6 cents, get a bed for the night, a drink, and a woman. But in the early 1860s, the swamp began to decline, and as it did, the part of Basin Street that would become the main hub of Storyville began to rise in levels of vice. But the true novelty of Storyville was that clear legal delineation allowed the tightly compacted vice industry to form its own neighborhood. Basin Street became its signature streetscape, informally known as The Line. Beyond it was a place where magnificent mansions became gaudy sporting houses and prostitutes called down from balconies to men walking down the line. It produced an iconic gateway to the district in the form of Tom Anderson's famous Basin Street Saloon. It had accessibility, being located minutes from the French Quarter, Central Business District, and Canal Street, and steps from a new train station which deposited out-of-towners directly onto the line. This station was hugely responsible for the district becoming such a popular tourist destination for men looking to pay for a night of pleasurable company. Although there was already growing concern about the excessive graft being paid to police to turn the other way, any real attempt at reform was rendered totally ineffective because too many people were benefiting off the district, especially from its high alcohol sales. Only 3 years after its foundation, Storyville was already home to 230 brothels, 60 houses of assignation, and scores of cribs, concert saloons, bars, cafes, and restaurants. It was also the nurturing place for the early jazz musicians who would later become hailed as kings of their craft: Buddy Bolden, Freddie Kepper, and Joe Oliver. As many as 3,000 prostitutes lived and worked in Storyville at any given time, but this was not necessarily by choice. In order to curb the district sex work even more, a modification to Story's ordinance required that prostitutes not only had to work exclusively within Storyville, but also had to live there permanently. This decree, along with the raise of the age of consent from 14 to 16 in 1899, led to concerns over whether or not the small district could accommodate that many newcomers. A later stipulation, coinciding with the rise of Jim Crow laws across the South, made it unlawful for any prostitute of the colored or black race to occupy any house outside the limits of Perdido, Gravier, Franklin, and Locust Streets, creating a so-called uptown district that matched an old antebellum vice concentration. Similar difficulties existed for women in northern cities as well. They were shut out of the labor force in Chicago's ultra-racialized economy, and so sex work in the Levi district often became the only means of survival. In either city, the price of a prostitute often depended on the quality of the bordello in which they worked and what the John wanted to do. It could cost as low as 50 cents to provide a man with a brief fling on the edge of town, and up to $10 in a high-class establishment like Lulu White's Mahogany Hall, where the patron could spend time and relax more. This kind of affordable, tourist-friendly environment is likely what popularized the district's blue books. First created in about 1896 and mass-produced from 1909 to 1915, the Blue Books were 40-page publications containing the names, race, and addresses of over 700 prostitutes that were operating in the city. They were published by Billy Struve, who was the manager of Anderson's Saloon, on the second floor of Mahogany Hall and sold throughout the city for only a quarter. The well-known motto inscribed on the preface was "Honi soit qui mal y pense," shame on him who thinks evil of it. Blue Books also held advertisements from local distillers, cigar makers, drugstores, and taxi companies, but most enticing of all were the puffs and occasional photographs, which extolled the graces and qualifications of Storyville's most prominent sirens. Many of these were taken by a professional Creole photographer named John Ernest Joseph Belloc, who took pictures for ship and machine companies and captured the life of prostitutes in private. After his death, many of his negatives and prints were mysteriously destroyed or damaged. The ones that survived were acquired by the photographer Lee Friedlander and put into a book called E.J. Belloc, The Storyville Portraits. The district had been intended to remove illicit activity from public view, and while it had become widely popular and prosperous, its nascent connections to Jim Crow could not be ignored. Alderman Story and his peers were self-styled progressive businessmen who were really nothing more than white supremacists who believed that prostitutes, people of color, carnival, excrement, and illicit and interracial sex all constituted pollution, that all contaminated what they touched, literally and figuratively. Storyville may have made these things out of sight for the general civilian, but they were certainly visible for anyone who cared to look. Rather than obscure the city's history of interracial sex, the district exploited it to the nth degree and became famous for its octoroon prostitutes, women who were 1/8 black and looked white. It was a term dating back to before the Civil War to denote a beautiful and tragic young woman with good manners and fine breeding, often fated to some kind of sexual slavery. It became a well-known archetype in contemporary literary works such as Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin and Dion Boucicault's play The Octoroon, or Life in Louisiana. Half a century later, at the same time that the Plessy v. Ferguson case was legally denying the existence of people of mixed race, Storyville reclaimed it as not only an exclusively feminine title, but an erotic and purchasable one. And in doing so, it helps redefine postbellum New Orleans for the northerner, the tourist, the investor, and even the local in ways that would ultimately serve only Jim Crow. The first of the French Quarter's grand brothels was built by a madam named Kate Townsend in 1866 at what was then 40 Basin Street. Townsend's real name was Catherine Cunningham, and she was originally from Liverpool, England. At the age of 18, she sailed to New Orleans and became a resident of two brothels, one on Philippa Street and the other on Custom House. It would be the first and last time that she was known as just one of the girls. 6 years later, she rented out a house of her own and formed connections with influential city officials and politicians. Like many proprietresses after her, she used these new friendships to fund the creation of an extravagant brothel. The cost was said to have exceeded $100,000 and was furnished with gaudy magnificence. High-class trade, elegance, and excessive formality brought great prosperity to Kate Townsend for half a dozen years. She would suffer a much more violent death than some of her successors, however. On November 3, 1833, Townsend was stabbed 11 times by her longtime lover, Treville Egbert Sykes. Her estate would not be settled until 5 years later, as Sykes kept trying to wrench away her money and property. It was ultimately leased to Molly Johnson, who was one of Townsend's girls. And after her death, the brothel was rechristened Elk Place and closed down as a place of business in 1897, since it did not fall within the boundaries of the newly formed Storyville. One of Townsend's contemporaries was an extremely fortunate woman named Hattie Hamilton. After being divorced by her husband Samuel Plume in 1866, she started working in brothels on Rampart and Custom House, where she so impressed the Louisiana Senator Robert Beers that he made her her own madam on 21 Basin Street as well as his mistress. Although 21 became extremely lucrative under her management, she usually left the actual care of the house to others and spent most of her time with the senator. But in 1870, after a drunken quarrel between the two, Beers was found dying from a stab wound, and Hamilton was taken into custody. She was released within 24 hours later, however, and it was speculated that friends and relatives of Beers feared Hamilton's knowledge of secrets related to the senator that they could not go further with the investigation. Business at 21 understandably fell away after this incident, so Hamilton simply opened another brothel and ran it until she died of natural causes in quiet retirement in Virginia in 1882. She wanted to leave everything to her second lover, David Jackson, but her now-grown son, John Plume, contested her will by invoking the Louisiana law of concubinage, which prevented courtesans from leaving their property to their lovers. After this legal dispute and further debt payments, Jackson would end up receiving only $71.92, 1/10 of Hamilton's estate. The next generation of madams would carry on the traditions of vulgar luxury and tough luck established by Townsend and Hamilton, as well as learn how to better cater to visitors' eccentric tastes. And few were more famously successful at being kinky than Josie Arlington, who was also a top contender for having the hottest temper and snobbiest attitude of any madam in America. Born Mary Dubler in New Orleans in 1864 as the daughter of German immigrants, she began working as a prostitute when she was 17 to support her family. She developed a reputation as an irascible brawler, and it was not until her lover Philip Lebrano shot her brother Peter in 1895 that she realized she had to cool down and improve her manners. She ran an establishment on 172 Custom House for 3 years and filled it with gracious, amiable foreign girls who would beat home only to gentlemen of taste and refinement. She and political boss Tom Anderson were among the first to hear about Alderman Story's ordinance, and so both purchased choice Basin Street properties along the entrance to the district. Josie would spend her first fortune turning her famous Arlington house on 225 Basin into a 4-story mansion with bay windows and works by respected painters. She had about 10 to 20 women in her service now, who she called her nieces, and for the price of $5 male visitors would be eligible to take part in the circuses they put on, publicly performed sex acts that also provided specialists for fetishists and sadomasochists. For the next 10 years, Josie ran the Arlington as smoothly as could be, and the richer she got off of it, the snootier she became. It reportedly cost $35,000 for her to have a private residence constructed on Esplanade Street. But once again, it would take a tragedy to humble Josie. A fire broke out in 1905 that severely damaged the Arlington and caused Josie and the girls to move down the street into rooms above Anderson's saloon, who had kept himself busy by establishing himself as a member of the state legislature and the unofficial mayor of Storyville. During this time, he would also become one of Josie's closest friends. Upon her retirement in 1909, he bought a large portion of her business, and his saloon was ever after known as the Arlington Annex. Josie spent her twilight years a much more introspective and moody woman than she had been before, living with a favorite niece in her Esplanade mansion. She died on February 14, 1914, and was buried in Metairie Cemetery, although her family did have her body moved once her tomb became a controversial, albeit legendary, tourist attraction. It was perhaps inevitable that at the turn of the century, the New Orleans brothels would seek to provide octoroon girls as a satisfiable fetish for its customers. But it is certainly curious that two of the most prominent and successful madams of the Storyville era were of mixed ancestry themselves. Lulu White, who proclaimed herself as the Diamond Queen of the demi-monde, became notorious throughout Storyville and wider New Orleans for her sensational personality, her many transgressions of legal and racial codes, and her reliance on the association of New Orleans with interracial sex, slave auctions, and the literary trope of the tragic octoroon to make her business in the flesh trade as profitable as possible. Until its forced closure in 1917, she was the owner and operator of one of the most frequented and extravagant brothels in Storyville. Mahogany Hall supposedly contained 5 parlors, 40 prostitutes, 15 bedrooms with adjoined bathrooms, and Tiffany stained glass windows. Jelly Roll Morton, Carmencita, and Tony Jackson were among the popular entertainers who would perform for White's clientele and sometimes even lodge at the hall too. It was this clientele, made up of some of the most powerful and wealthy men in Louisiana, that allowed White to so often get away with flouting the rules of segregation and showing off her wealth. Beautiful octoroon women had long been classified as the subordinate prerogatives of the upper-class Southern white gentleman, and yet here was this assertive and exhibitionist woman who fashioned herself an ambiguous racial identity. Although she was born in Selma, Alabama, she claimed in her census records to be an immigrant from the West Indies. This ambiguity flew in the face of the omnipresent racial binary that was taking hold in the nation. Based solely on her appearance, Lulu White was not a black person posing as an octoroon, nor an octoroon passing for white, nor a white person posing as an octoroon. Because of her obscured origins and her larger-than-life, sexually confident persona that was so unlike other women of color, it became impossible to truly categorize her. Racial categorization and mystery became tools that White often used during her time at Mahogany Hall. In the Hall's Blue Book, photographs of several of her prostitutes all appear to be white, even though the text describes them as octoroons. This brochure served as a kind of strategic menu of sexual offerings, and included the same kind of ambiguity and self-fashioning as we find in White's New Orleans census records. In addition, the true ancestry of these women is almost entirely unknown, and although their names may suggest certain ethnicities, none of it is definite. What Lulu White is trying to accomplish was to prove that her girls had African blood in them, based solely on their affiliation with her and her bordello, where only white men would be allowed to patronize them. It is an advertisement that perfectly illustrates how White and others were capitalizing on the transformation of the connotations of octoroon from racial into sexual. Aside from her many failed investment schemes, White's good luck would continue to hold even as Storyville began to wind down. She was arrested multiple times over the years, usually for disorderly house management or illegal liquor sales, but occasionally for violent offenses as well, like attempted murder. But she only served jail time after she was arrested on November 6, 1918, for violating the Draft Act, which prohibited prostitution within 10 miles of a military facility. Her sentence was to be a year, but she served only 3 months after applying for a pardon and citing her poor health. Once she was free, White of course returned to New Orleans and immediately resumed her business. She continued to run a brothel until her death on August 20th, 1931, possibly in the residence of former Madame Willie Piazza. Willie Piazza, also known as the Countess, was the other major octoroon madam. She was born in 1865 in Jackson, Mississippi to an unmarried teenage couple of a black mother named Celia Caldwell and a white Italian father named Vincent Piazza. When she was 15, her father left to go work in Vicksburg, and a few years later she moved away as well to New Orleans. She started her own brothel surprisingly quickly, and identified both herself and those who worked for her as octoroons, another instance of eroticizing mixed women to garner a wealthy, exclusively white male clientele like at Mahogany Hall. Only inside Storyville could Piazza have thrived as she did by promoting interracial sex in the early 20th century, and although doing so earned her the harsh condemnation and criticisms of city reformers, she shrugged it off and made enough money to buy and renovate a $12,000 upscale brothel at 317 North Basin Street. It ended up being so profitable that she paid off the mortgage in only 2 years and began cultivating an image of European sophistication for her and her employees. The Piazza girls stood staunchly against the idea of the tragic octoroon and soon became known all over town for being able to enjoy unique power, wealth, and social freedoms. While women of color working as domestic were making between $30 and $90 per year, many of the women of Storyville earned between $1,000 and $2,000 annually. This impressive salary enabled them to buy fine clothes, ride in personal carriages, go to dance halls at their leisure, and learn how to play and write music. When the city later attempted to segregate Storyville and shut down her operation, Piazza took her case to the Louisiana State Supreme Court and won. Her victory was short-lived, however. Segregating the district had been local officials' last attempt to save part of the district from federal closure, and so shortly after the case was settled, the entirety of Storyville was shuttered. Piazza continued living on Basin Street after the district's demise, all the while sailing in the Caribbean on her yacht, accumulating more real estate, and living out the remainder of her life in a quiet but dignified fashion. On November 2, 1932, she died of breast cancer in New Orleans, leaving behind a substantial estate that, for once, was not fought over by family members or paramours. Anne Cook was a popular blues and gospel singer born in rural Louisiana sometime in the early 1900s, and like Kate Townsend and Willie Piazza before her, decided to move to New Orleans to make her way in the world when she was just a teenager. She lived in a section of Storyville that was so tough and consistently brimming with gang violence that it was unofficially known as the Battlefield. This was also the birthplace of Louis Armstrong and the neighborhood of Buddy Bolden, who was Cook's musical contemporary. Like many poor women of color, Cook's job opportunities were a strict binary of domestic worker in white households or prostitute in the district. Her mother had been the former, and she herself chose the latter as a temporary measure until she could support herself full-time with her singing career. At the age of 30, she was able to find herself a long-term accommodating parlor, but one where she did not have to sell her body. Willie Piazza's brothel on North Basin Street, which was where Cook solidified her reputation as a master of blues and gospel tunes. After Storyville was dismantled, Anne Cook was one of the first of the district's popular figures, prostitute or entertainer, to move her act into the French Quarter, specifically the cafes of South Rampart Street. Whereas other musicians left the city to bolster their careers, Cook became more and more famous right where she was. She was so famous among the jazz musicians, in fact, that when she didn't show up for a recording date of Louis Dumain's Jazzola 8 in 1927, band members searched the city, retrieved her from the cafe where she had sung the previous night, and whisked her away to the session before the recording crew from Victor Records could get away. But Cook chose to quit the blues life while she was ahead. In the 1940s and 50s, she took up gospel music and continued with it until her death on September 29, 1962. In the final years of Storyville, the levels of vice were becoming dangerous due to an ongoing feud between rival dance halls called the Tenderloin War that darkened the district's colorful reputation. As the feud dragged on, many left for safer parts of New Orleans and other cities, and by the mid-1910s, Storyville had lost a share of its prostitute population and entertainment action to the Tango Belt at the edge of the French Quarter, where, according to one enraged reformer in 1916, there was more vice in 1 hour than in the so-called Tenderloin District, Storyville proper, in 24 hours. A journalist referred to the Tango Belt as the abode of merrymaking and brazen vice, twin sister of the restricted district. This shift and rise in violence coincided with the United States' entry into the First World War, and as such was looking to set a standard to its European allies of high morality. The War Department did not want soldiers getting mixed up with the most notorious and morally depraved port city in the world, and so an edict issued by Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels ordered it to be closed, citing it as a bad and dangerous influence. Although Mayor Martin Behrman strongly protested, saying that the district's activities could be made illegal but never unpopular, he could do nothing. On November 12, 1917, Storyville was officially no more. But Behrman was right. When the district was shut down, the newly evicted madams and their charges simply moved into other parts of town, and the quarter, nearby and cheap, was the favored destination. Whatever gains the quarter had made in quality of life were now reversed. Saloon keepers quickly followed their example. So did musicians like Anne Cook. Although national morality had been served, the sex industry continued much as before. The remaining Creole families moved uptown, fed up with the depravity of their neighbors, and the Tango Belt clubs that had been closed that summer reopened at the war's end. Soon, all along St. Louis and Dauphin streets, post-Storyville prostitutes positioned themselves in windows, Amsterdam style, trolling for Johns. The Upper French Quarter, conversely, drew prostitutes who were more likely to be white or otherwise fancier and demanded higher prices from a larger and more moneyed white client pool. The legendary bordellos, many of which were already beginning to decline before the district's closure, could not survive the renewed wave of social conservatism in the 1920s, and lived on as much smaller whorehouses and speakeasies. Since the streetwalkers and crib girls were now without the legal status of a protected district, they had to make their own arrangements for police and political protection. But they managed to continue making a living, much as they'd always done, over the course of the next decade. The 1920s saw a slow change take place in the French Quarter, one that was formed completely by pigeonholing almost an entire former district's worth of people only a few blocks south. And as the age of Prohibition gave way to the age of Depression and war, the female titans of White, Arlington, Piazza, and their lowlier kinswomen faded from popular history into legend, and it was not until the 1940s that historical preservationists started being able to keep the last of their old bordellos intact, to serve as the physical reminder of a time when the city aldermen acknowledged that the sins of the flesh were inevitable and must be satiated. And so he and his allies simply looked Satan in the eye, cut a deal, and gave him his own address.
There is a house in